Hey, hi, hello. Welcome to Diana Emerson. Today we're listening to The New Detectives.
Right now in the United States, more than 3,000 criminals sit on death row for murder. Only 42 of them are women. It's easy to assume that women aren't as inclined to lethal violence. But maybe women are simply better at getting away with it, shielded by our wrong assumptions about what constitutes a killer. But once the manicured finger of suspicion points to them, it's up to forensic investigators to prove their guilt. Early on February 1st, 1988, paramedics in the Durham County, North Carolina Sheriff's Office were called to the home of Barbara and Russell Stagger. There had been a terrible accident. Russell Stagger had been shot in the head while he slept. A .25 caliber semi-automatic pistol and a spent shell casing lay next to him on the bed. Through her tears, Barbara Stagger explained what happened. Groggy with sleep, she had accidentally fumbled with a gun used for protecting their home against burglars. She had brushed the trigger. The pistol had fired. Though critically wounded, Russell Stagger was still alive. Doctors did everything they could for Stagger, but within hours, the grim prognosis was clear. Barbara was told her husband of 9 years had no hope of recovery. She signed a consent form to take him off life support. Russell Stagger died that afternoon without regaining consciousness. The whole community mourned his loss. Stagger had been well respected in Durham as the high school baseball team's head coach. Once, when the budget for bats and gloves was cut, he took a stand for the team and donated his own money to make up the shortfall. When Stagger wasn't defending his players, he was defending his country as a staff sergeant in the National Guard. Police were prepared to list his death an accident. But his first wife, Lynn Snow, wasn't so sure. She went to police with her suspicions. She'd remained friends with Russell, who told her that his relationship with Barbara had soured, even to the point that he feared for his safety. She urged police not to dismiss the case so quickly. According to Snow, Russell said that Barbara Stagger had a ruinous appetite for cash, clothes, and jewelry. And Russell was never sure where she was getting all her money. To check on the first wife's story, investigators questioned other friends of the victim.
You received the best training.
They learned from his fellow National Guardsmen that Russell Stagger was a firearms instructor and extremely cautious around guns. To Police Captain Ricky Buchanan, the questions raised were enough to keep the investigation open.
And nobody with that kind of knowledge about weapons would have slept with one under their pillow, particularly not locked, not cocked, and the safety off. Nobody in their right mind does. Uh, but that was what would have had to happen if you believe Barbara's story.
Buchanan wasn't sure he believed it anymore. It was time to look at the widow more closely. Investigators found that arrest warrants had been issued on Barbara Stagger for her chronic check bouncing. She had even forged her husband's name on checks and loan applications. But each time she somehow managed to pay off her debts and dodge a conviction. Then she would borrow and spend even more, leading to ever more devious ways of getting the cash she craved. She'd written a book called Untimely Death about a man who accidentally killed himself. Though it was fiction, it was based on Barbara's experience with her first husband, Larry Ford. He died in a freak shooting accident 1 year before Barbara married Russell Stagger. Through her writing, Barbara had found a way to cash in on the tragedy.
She sent it to the Doubleday publishers, I recall. They sent her a rejection letter. But then she took the logo off of the rejection letter and taped it onto a sheet of paper and typed out an acceptance letter where she was going to get, I think, maybe $25,000 advance on the book.
Using the forged letter as collateral, Barbara Stagger secured a bank loan. But curious friends called the publisher to get the book's release date and learned it was rejected. When Russell found out, he managed to forgive Barbara. She returned the $25,000 and the bank didn't prosecute. But to detectives, it seemed that a new target lay squarely in the crosshairs of her ambition. $25,000 would be small change compared to Russell Stagger's life insurance. When all his policies were added up, his death would net this two-time widow more than $200,000. Barbara Stagger was known to lie for money. Buchanan suspected she would kill for it. He knew she'd fired the fatal bullet. Now he had to prove it was no accident. Barbara had told police she didn't know how to shoot a gun, but Russell Stagger's friends disagreed. They said Barbara was an excellent shot. The victim himself had taught her. It appeared that his lessons may have been turned against him. Investigators knew that if they could find more inconsistencies in Barbara's story, they could build their case. They interviewed all the paramedics, police officers, and doctors who had heard Barbara's account of the accident. But no one had gotten the same story from her. She told paramedics she had reached for the gun when a barking dog made her think a prowler was near the house. She told someone else that her son's alarm had awakened her.
357? Yes, sir. Okay.
When the gun had gone off, she'd been putting it away, lest her husband think the boy was a burglar.
And I see him there.
Barbara Stagger was spinning a tangle of lies even she couldn't sort out. But police had a plan to snare her in her own way. To catch a killer, investigators set an ingenious trap. To get Russell Stagger's widow to stick to a story, they asked Barbara Stagger to reenact the accident for them.
Thank you very much.
She was happy to oblige.
Well, Mrs. Speaker,
when detectives asked if they could videotape the demonstration,
Sure.
she said yes once again.
She shot her husband on Monday, and she crawled back in that bed on Friday. And I really don't think a person under normal circumstances would do that if it were an accidental shooting. And she reenacted it. And with no emotion, no hesitation.
This time, Barbara said that while in a sleepy haze, she had pulled out the pistol.
Started to get up, to get it out from under there, heard the noise, shocked, couldn't figure out what it was, sort of realized what had happened, turned over.
She put on her glasses and turned on the light. She cradled her husband's head in her lap, trying to revive him. When paramedics arrived, the victim still lay as if he were asleep, without ever having been moved. It was clear to authorities that Russell Stagger had received no first aid from his wife. In fact, between the time she phoned for help and the arrival of the paramedics, she had gotten dressed, all while her husband lay dying. After her taped performance, the only thing she wanted to know was how the insurance companies would know her husband's death was an accident. She wouldn't see a dime until such a ruling was officially on the books.
Well, thank you. We're not.
Detectives told her a little paperwork still remained. With that, they left. They had what they wanted on videotape.
There will never, ever be another gun.
I didn't give her any indication that she made me a happy man by any means. And when I left there, she was certain that it was going to be declared an accidental death. But I knew once she reenacted that we had her.
Detectives studied the videotape of Barbara Stagger's reenactment with an eye toward finding inconsistencies. She had told them the gun had gone off while she held it low next to the bed. Forensic science told a different story. The bullet pierced the lower right portion of the victim's skull and struck above the left eye. Based on his position, this suggested that the gun was tilted downward. But the way Barbara described the accident, the bullet would have moved in an upward trajectory.
And it indicated to us that she was above and behind Russ at the time she pulled the trigger.
That wasn't the only problem with the pantomime. If the pistol had fired under the bed sheets, as Barbara said, there would have been powder burns on the fabric. None were found. That suggested the gun was fired at a distance from the bed. And yet, the cartridge casing was lying next to the victim. Nothing was adding up, but all of it pointed to Barbara's guilt. It didn't stop there. Police learned that within hours of reenacting the incident, she and two family members presented the victim's will for probate. Though it was signed by Russell Stagger, it was witnessed only by members of Barbara's immediate family. The clerk recalled that Barbara showed little emotion during the process. When detectives learned how quickly Barbara had tried to push the document through, they examined it as potential evidence. Investigators compared the signature on the will to the victim's National Guard papers. They found that the will had definitely been forged. It was just one more page in Barbara's trail of worthless paper. The inheritance and the insurance money may have been her motive for killing her husband, or she may have just been eager to cash in on Russell's accident. Police needed a more tangible clue to link her to the intentional murder of her husband. Attention focused on the curious proximity of the shell casing to the victim's body. The gun was taken to the North Carolina State Bureau of Investigation Crime Lab in Raleigh. Experts here evaluate more than 30,000 pieces of evidence, local, federal, and military law enforcement agencies. In test firing Stagger's gun, investigators found that the bullet casing ejects at least 3.5 feet from the weapon. There was no logical way it could have landed so close to the victim's head, unless Barbara had moved it after she fired. Police learned that similar questions were raised during the death investigation of her first husband 10 years earlier. According to reports at the time of her first husband's death, police noted that the position possession of the shell casing was suspicious, but it wasn't documented well enough to make a case for homicide. It looked like Barbara was up to her old tricks. This time, she wasn't going to get away with it. Investigators felt they had developed a strong case against Barbara Stager. But the most compelling piece of evidence was found miles from the scene. One of Russell Stager's former students found an audio cassette in the high school gym. When it was played, his brother recognized the voice of his ex-coach, Russell Stager.
Coach Stager, you died a little while back. Sometimes I wonder. I'm just being paranoid about it.
Oh, man, what are you doing with that? Wait a minute, wait. No, you said you had something?
They took the tape to police. On it, Russell Stager poured out his apprehensions about his wife, from her compulsive spending to the death of her first husband and his creeping suspicion that he might be next. The tape, coupled with the crime lab bullet evidence, was enough to bring the case to trial. The prosecution carefully laid out the motives, the events leading to Russell Stager's death. Barbara's financial problems had come to a head. Without a massive infusion of cash, she would face bankruptcy. One morning, when the pressure became too great, Barbara Stager rose and took careful aim. The forensic evidence was compelling. The actual bullet trajectory did not agree with Barbara Stager's story. Neither did the spent shell's ejection path. When the district attorney played the haunting tape of Russell Stager's suspicions, it sealed Barbara's fate.
Well, it had traumatic impact. Hearing it in court, I mean, this is the first time that I know of that a homicide victim actually had his day in court and testified from the witness stand. Because it was just as if Russ himself was like.
Though Barbara Stager may have dreamed of gold, she was led away in chains of steel. Based on the forensic evidence, she was convicted of the first-degree murder of her husband and sentenced to life in prison. A shooting death leaves obvious clues behind, but killing with kindness can go undetected, sometimes for years. In April of 1989, Reverend Dwight Moore and his new wife Blanche were driving home to North Carolina after their honeymoon. It was a second marriage for both of them. They were happy to be making a fresh start. All was wedded bliss. Until on the Cape May Lewis ferry, Reverend Moore fell gravely ill. Blanche drove her husband home to Winston-Salem, determined to nurse him back to health.
No, sweetheart.
She was a fine cook and thought that some of her good food would do the trick. Despite her care, her new husband's condition grew worse. Finally, he was rushed to the hospital, suffering from severe abdominal cramps. His doctor believed he had come down with an intestinal flu. But the Reverend told him his symptoms began shortly after he cleaned his garage of old household chemicals. He believed that something there had made him ill. Or perhaps it was the chemicals he recently sprayed on his lawn. Doctors performed a series of tests to determine what he may have been exposed to. The results revealed a shocking level of arsenic. Because arsenic poisoning is uncommon, North Carolina's chief medical examiner, John Butts, was called to investigate where the toxin may have come from. He didn't believe it could have entered Reverend Moore's system from cleaning his garage.
Arsenic is used in some fungicides, insecticides, and so there are possibilities for unintentional or accidental poisoning, but they're quite rare.
Arsenic is a highly toxic metallic element. Everyone has traces of it in their body, but Reverend Moore demonstrated an almost superhuman tolerance to it. He consumed enough to kill 10 men. It would be almost impossible to accidentally ingest that much of the poison.
There are certain medications that do contain arsenic. They're usually mainly in veterinary medicine against certain types of parasites, but there are very, very few medications almost no medications that would be used in this country for humans that would contain arsenic.
His family gathered at his bedside, not sure if the Reverend would survive one of the highest levels of arsenic poisoning on record. Slowly, he regained his strength, fortified by some of his new wife's home cooking. The fact that he'd survived this long suggested that he built up a tolerance through many small doses over a period of time. In other words, he may have been systematically poisoned. His ordeal wasn't over yet. Further tests showed that his arsenic levels were increasing while he lay in the hospital. Suspecting foul play, the North Carolina State Bureau of Investigation cleared Reverend Moore's room and posted a guard at the door.
I'm gonna have to ask everyone to leave the room and go down to the waiting room.
The patient was to eat no more food brought from outside the hospital. Investigators had every indication that he was being poisoned by someone he knew, someone he trusted, perhaps even someone in his own family. Their first suspect was his son, a biochemist. He'd have the know-how to do it, but he didn't have the opportunity to administer the poison. While police worked to protect Reverend Moore, the hospital staff worked to cure him. He was treated with a chelating agent, a compound that bonded with the arsenic in his body to flush it out of his system. The treatment was as painful as the poison. Meantime, investigators interviewed him to determine some clue about who might have been poisoning him. As the conversation turned to his family, Moore described his courtship with Blanche. One detail caught the detective's attention. Blanche's previous boyfriend, Raymond Reed, had died of a disease with all the symptoms of a serious stomach flu, symptoms very similar to what the Reverend was suffering from.
Was there anything
Investigators began to delve into Blanche's past.
I don't think anything suspicious.
Oh, good morning, Blanche. How are you?
She had met her former boyfriend, Raymond Reed, while working in the grocery store he managed.
No.
They had been together for 15 years when Reed was diagnosed with Guillain-Barré syndrome, a debilitating nerve disease that attacks the spinal cord. It begins as numbness and can progress to paralysis and sometimes death. But another frightening aspect of Guillain-Barré is that it's the most common misdiagnosis for long-term arsenic poisoning. To test that theory, investigators requested Reed's complete medical records. While they waited, they collected a sample of Reverend Moore's hair to see how long he'd been poisoned.
More if you take a close that.
Hair can be a very valuable substance for testing in cases of arsenic poisoning because as the hair grows, any arsenic that's present in the blood at that time will get deposited into the roots of the hair.
Like a modern-day Delilah, Blanche thought that by cutting her husband's hair, She weakened the state's case against her.
Best looking guy in the neighborhood.
But when she brought her brother to the hospital to give Reverend Moore a close trim, she was too late. Investigators had already gathered the sample they needed. When Reverend Moore's hair was tested, it was polluted with arsenic from follicle to tip, meaning he'd been fed a steady diet of the toxin. He'd had 2 large doses 7 and 8 months earlier, in November and December 1988. He'd spent time in the hospital, but the poison went undetected. The same couldn't be said for Raymond Reed. When his medical records arrived, investigators made an alarming discovery. He'd been done in by a clerical error. At one point during his hospitalization, his doctors had ordered a test for heavy metals. But the results were temporarily lost in a blizzard of paperwork. In the interim, Reed died. 3 years later, when detectives were looking into Blanche Moore's past, doctors and police finally saw those results. Raymond Reed had been poisoned. It appeared that Blanche was seasoning her dishes with more than just sugar and spice. In North Carolina, investigators suspected that Blanche Moore was a serial poisoner. According to Forsyth County District Attorney Vincent Rabel, Moore had profited from the death of her boyfriend, Raymond Reed.
She got him to put her into his will during the time that he was in the hospital being poisoned. She was almost destitute financially until Mr. Reed died.
Very nice guy.
Detectives had only their suspicions to guide them. If Blanche had really poisoned Reed, the evidence was buried with him. Now, investigators literally had to dig for what they needed to make their case.
So this happened.
Okay. Though arsenic poisoning is rarely suspected, it is easy to find once you know what to look for. The element lingers in the body long after it's finished its deadly work. The SBI got permission to exhume Reed's body.
Well, the major trail the arsenic leaves is that it doesn't go away. Arsenic binds to the tissues. It's a heavy, described as a heavy metal. It's an element. It's sort of the ideal thing to have to go look for because it will be there.
A large, recently consumed dose of arsenic will show up in stomach x-rays. Another telltale sign can appear as discolored bands running across fingernails and toenails. Reed's body bore these marks. The most accurate way to determine the presence of arsenic in remains is to perform the Reinsch test. In the medical examiner's office, tissue samples were taken from the body of Reed. The samples were then dissolved in acid. And a copper wire was placed in the resulting solution. If arsenic is present, it will attach to the wire, turning it black. The test was positive. Judging from Reed's hair samples, he had been poisoned for 6 months before he died. Further tests confirmed the diagnosis.
But when we ran the concentrations of arsenic on his tissues, he had very high levels, and certainly in levels that were associated with toxicity, fatal levels, potentially lethal levels.
Investigators now had 2 poisoned men, and one of them was dead. The only link between them was Blanche Moore. To Blanche's friends, this appeared to be a run of bad luck. But to detectives, Blanche seemed very lucky indeed to have dodged suspicion for so long. Once Reed had gone on to his reward, Blanche inherited hers, $80,000. But Reed wasn't necessarily her first victim. Investigators learned learned that 13 years before Reed's illness, her first husband, James N. Taylor, also died a mysterious, lingering death. His body was exhumed. It, too, tested positive for arsenic poisoning. The pattern was irrefutable. In Blanche's world, it appeared that the way to a man's heart and his money was through his stomach. But Blanche's current husband, Reverend Moore, was even bigger game. His insurance and assets made him worth $250,000 dead. But she couldn't collect it yet. Reverend Moore was still fighting for his life. Doctors usually do not suspect poisoning until it is too late. But unlike Taylor and Reed, Reverend Moore lived to count his blessings. The forensic evidence helped agents follow Blanche's well-worn trail of murder. She lured her victims to their deaths, pretending to nurture them during their moment of need. Blanche kept bringing food to Reed until she killed him. Doubtless, she had planned to serve Reverend Moore the same fate. Even though the minister's health no longer hung in the balance, the state's case against his wife certainly did. They needed to prove she was a serial poisoner.
And we were very much concerned that she would weave her web of deceit and charm with the jury and convince them that she was not to blame.
Hi, Mrs. Moore. Hi,
Starting with her arrest for the murders of James Taylor and Raymond Reed, she refuted all charges, claiming she was the victim of a massive conspiracy.
Not me.
You have the right to talk to a lawyer and have them present with you. When she took the stand, she denied bringing any food outside the hospital and accused many nurses and doctors of lying about her and accused them of falsifying medical records that were created at the time, which reported that she was feeding the patients food from home.
More than 50 witnesses from several hospitals clearly remembered Blanche's facade of kindness and her culinary largesse. In truth, Blanche had been cooking like a fiend. Her own testimony cued the jury that she was lying. But it took careful forensic analysis of all the evidence to prove it.
Do you want to know?
Blanche Moore was convicted of first-degree murder for poisoning Raymond Reed.
Did you get
She was also indicted for assault with a deadly weapon upon Reverend Moore. He survived the attack and was soon divorced from his murderous bride. But Blanche Moore was fated to get a dose of her own medicine. The judge sentenced her to death by her choice of poison gas or lethal injection. Because she was already on death row, she wasn't prosecuted for the death of her first husband, James Taylor. 60% of women who kill use poison. It destroys the victim from within, while it preserves the killer's veneer of innocence. But the most subtle murderer is one who never even goes to the scene of the crime. On January 21st, 1992, a difficult land and air search for a missing man near Kinston, North Carolina, came to a gruesome end. Authorities had finally found the body of Billy White, a successful life insurance salesman. He had been gunned down next to his van on a lonely dirt road. The victim's pockets were turned inside out. His wallet was empty. At first glance, robbery appeared to be the motive. State Bureau of Investigation Special Agent Ken Raper was called to the scene. He didn't have much to go on.
It appeared he'd been shot twice, once in the chest and once in his lower left side. It was a shotgun. I thought at times it was probably double aught buck or maybe triple aught buck. But there were no shell casings at the scene. 20 feet from the victim.
The only clue left behind was a single tire track in the mud near the victim's head. It was carefully photographed from all angles for comparison in case a suspect's car was found. Investigators spoke with the victim's wife, Sylvia White. She told them she believed her husband was killed on his way to see a new client. Sylvia sometimes worked as her husband's secretary. She told police that a man named Timmy Connors had called her about buying a large insurance policy. She had referred Connors to her husband so he could close the sale. It was well known that Billy would drive anywhere to meet a client. His eagerness might have led him to his death.
He was a nice guy, a little bit quiet.
Police interviewed the victim's co-workers. None had ever seen Connors. And Sylvia's only contact with him had been over the phone. It wasn't much to go on, but the mysterious client was the only lead police had. The SBI reached out to the community for tips through television and newspaper ads. Before long, an anonymous informant called the police with a tip. He told them that a thin, long-haired carpenter had been soliciting people to murder Billy White. The informant told them the construction site where this person worked, but he didn't know the man's name.
What are you working on?
Investigators went to the construction site, but found no one who matched the description. At the same time, investigators worked with local law enforcement to go through mugshots, hoping to make an ID. Police learned while interviewing members of Sylvia White's family that she had hired a man named Linwood Taylor to do some work for her. Taylor's mugshot matched the description. Investigators also found that he worked at the job site mentioned by the informant. Taylor was called in for questioning. At first, he denied knowing the Whites, but investigators knew that was a lie and told him so. Eventually, he confessed to committing the murder. He said the motive was money. He was hired to kill Billy White. He admitted that the person who planned the whole thing was Sylvia White. SBI agent Eric Smith was present at Taylor's interview.
He said he had known Sylvia White for about a year, and that during that time she had told them stories of her husband's poor treatment. He had abused her and things of that nature. Mr. Taylor said he developed a lot of sympathy for Miss Sylvia White, but at this time, when we interviewed him, he said a lot of the stories or scenarios she had given him, he didn't believe any longer.
Taylor alleged that Sylvia had offered him $20,000 and a minivan if he would kill her husband. He said he would do it, but couldn't muster the courage. Sylvia grew impatient. Then she divulged a secret to him.
She basically told him if he couldn't do it, she'd do it herself. That she had done it before, and she had had a stepchild that she felt wasn't right, so she put a bag over its head until it stopped breathing.
The death of Sylvia's stepson 10 years earlier had been attributed to an accident. If Taylor's allegations about Sylvia were true, then the grieving widow would be unmasked as a cold-hearted killer who would stop at nothing to achieve her ends.
She came to me.
Now they had to gather tangible proof that she was involved in the killings.
For what? $3,000. I thought asked him to come up here. Yeah.
In Taylor's confession, he told police that his uncle, Ernest Basden, was also involved in the murder of Billy White.
Mr. Basden was here. Hello, Mr. Basden. Thanks for coming in. Why don't you have a seat?
Basden was called to the station.
Mr. Taylor yesterday. And,
At first, he denied killing the insurance
he
salesman.
goes back, and then
But then, like his
he's in his
nephew,
ring.
he realized that honesty is the best policy. He too confessed to the killing. He told investigators that he had pulled the trigger himself. He had needed the money, Sylvia White's money. Now, police had two independent confessions, and both of them implicated the victim's widow. Her money had paid for her husband's assassins, but it couldn't buy their silence. Agents still had to back up the confessions with solid evidence if they were to build a case against Sylvia White. All they had to link the men to the crime were the tire tracks lifted from the scene. A search warrant was obtained to examine the tires on Linwood Taylor's cars.
They towed a Cutlass and a Camaro. And when I arrived, walked over and looked at the tire treads, the tires themselves on both vehicles, and then determined that we need to take the ones off of the Camaro. That they indeed were consistent with the tread design that I had observed at the scene that day.
An FBI laboratory examination of his tire treads confirmed that Taylor's car had been at the scene of the murder. Next, detectives went to Taylor's house, where they uncovered treasure among the trash.
At Taylor's house, the crime scene investigators went out, and what they found was a trash pile in the rear where trash had been burned, and they were able to discover the remaining portions of several shotgun shells in the fire. The plastic portion had been burned, destroyed, but the brass casing was still there.
Presumably, these were the spent shells missing from the murder scene. The FBI seized the shells for analysis, but they still didn't have the murder weapon. Taylor and Basden said they had cut up the shotgun with a hacksaw, embedded it in a bucket of cement, and hurled it off a bridge.
We went out to the Neuse River area, and the divers went in the water, and within 5 to 10 minutes, they had located the bucket on the north side of the bridge, just as Mr. Taylor had described, filled with cement.
Now, police literally had concrete evidence to support Taylor's story, but they still had to prove it was the murder weapon. Because it could no longer be fired, similar guns were test-fired at the FBI lab. Ballistic tests verified Taylor's story about the distance from which White had been shot. Taylor and Basden were now firmly implicated. But connections between Sylvia White and the conspiracy were still weak. Sylvia had insisted that she didn't know Taylor. And yet investigators had witnesses who had seen them together. Taylor admitted receiving a partial payment of $1,500 from White several days after the murder. Detectives traced the trail of cash back to its source.
A friend of the family and business partner of Mr. White had given Sylvia $1,500 a few days earlier. We were able to locate a bank that had cashed that check, which Miss White had endorsed. Mr. Taylor told us that the money he received was in an envelope, a banking envelope.
It was from the same bank that had cashed Sylvia's check. Taylor also told police that before Sylvia hired him, she had tried to kill her husband herself. She told him she'd read up on poisonous plants at the library. She tried feeding some to him, but they only made him ill. Investigators knew that if they could link Sylvia to books on poisons, they'd be able to prove that she intended to kill her husband. FBI agents went to the library to search for clues. There they found several volumes on poisonous plants. One book had missing pages. According to the index, those pages dealt with water hemlock and poison hemlock, plants common to the area. Agent Smith had the book analyzed for fingerprints.
I thought it was a 50-50 shot, but it was something that we really needed to connect Miss White to this murder. And he collected it, removed it from the library, and sent it to the lab.
A palm print was found inside the book next to the missing pages. A comparison with Sylvia White's print showed a perfect match. Step by step, the State Bureau of Investigation built their case against Sylvia White and her co-conspirators.
The evidence in this case from our SBI laboratory conclusively tied Linwood Taylor's vehicle to the crime scene. The story provided by Sylvia White to Linwood Taylor about Timmy Connors were able to corroborate through interviews. The final item was Sylvia White's palm print in the book on poisonous plants in North Carolina that conclusively tied her to the book.
The collected evidence positively implicated Sylvia White in the death of her husband. As the forensic evidence was pieced together, the full conspiracy came out. Basden said that his nephew, Linwood Taylor, had approached him about the murder at a party in October of the previous year. But the offer fell on deaf ears until Basden fell on hard times. In January, he agreed to do the job for money. Taylor, posing as Tim Connors, had already established a phone rapport with Billy White. Counting on the insurance salesman's willingness to go anywhere to clinch a deal, Taylor lured his victim to the remote dirt road. There, Basden ambushed White and pulled the trigger. They took the salesman's cash and collected the spent shell casings. Then they fled to Taylor's house, where they burned the shells and their clothing. But there was still more evidence to destroy. Taylor sawed the shotgun into pieces and embedded them in the cement. Then they ditched the gun in the river. That done, Taylor and Basden thought they were in the clear, but investigators caught up with them, and with Sylvia White. The case against the widow was now solid, but even so, Sylvia White may have gotten away with murder after all, at least so far. To strengthen their case against her, the FBI checked Taylor's story that Sylvia had smothered her stepson 10 years earlier.
We exhumed the body and transported it to Chapel Hill, and the results of that medical examination revealed injuries to young Billy White that had been sustained prior to his death, for which there was no documented medical treatment. One of those injuries was a fracture to the skull.
A plastic bag was also found in the child's windpipe. The victim was clearly murdered. Before the trial for her husband's murder commenced, Sylvia White was convicted of the murder of her stepson. She received a life sentence. But she wasn't out of the woods. With Linwood Taylor's confession and the forensic evidence that backed it up, Sylvia White had no defense. In 1993, she pleaded guilty to second-degree murder in the death of her husband, and was sentenced to another life term plus 10 years. Linwood Taylor and Ernest Basden also were convicted of first-degree murder. Taylor got life. For pulling the trigger, Basden was sentenced to death. Sylvia White took a businesslike approach to killing her husband. She hired someone else to do the work for her, leaving herself one step removed. Blanche Moore and Barbara Stagger had other techniques for distancing themselves from their crimes. Blanche Taylor Moore posed as the nurturing figure as she fed poison to her victims. And Barbara Stagger killed through feigned incompetence, staging her murders to look like tragic accidents. In each case, forensics told a different story. Women may not be as outwardly violent as men, but they can be as effectively lethal. Police are just now starting to notice it. But whether a killing is stealthy or obvious, discreet or bloody, when forensic science is brought to bear on the case, the odds of bringing a female murderer to justice are equally